Excellent. Okay. So like I mentioned, the idea today is intro to integral project design for social transformation.
And by the
And
way, just to interrupt you, Andrew, if you have
please,
questions, if anyone has questions as Andrew's presenting, you can put them in the chat. And if I can respond to them briefly there, I will. And if not, we'll save them for the Q&A at the end. So feel
indeed.
free to interact in that way.
Yes, please. Um, and so here we just have a few points in no given particular order that help us lean into, well, what does an integral project mean? What might it mean to design a project from an integral perspective or using an integral framework? And so we have many different thoughts and ideas around that, and only have captured a few here throughout this presentation. But one that's very simple and straightforward is it means consciously participating in manifesting a vision for a better future. And really that word manifestation, or you could use enactment there as well, is we really recognize that our participation, our intentions, the ways that we are showing up directly contribute to the creation of the realities that we experience. And so that orientation of participation rather than observation, analysis, problem solving from a more third person objective perspective is incredibly important. We also have an integral approach to project design takes into account non-linear change processes and multiple perspectives. We recognize that the simple Newtonian cause and effect understanding of reality is actually quite limited. And when you really kind of peek under the hood, you see countless examples of how that's not as straightforward as it seems. And so what might it mean to explore that non-linearity and really lean into the systems thinking and perspective, where we start to look at feedback loops and those cycles and those processes that aren't as linear as we tend to map out in a typical project design. And we integrate multiple perspectives along the way. We recognize that all of us have a unique perspective, and we really work to integrate those perspectives rather than just notice them, name them, validate them, and continue on with our own ideas of what we think should be happening. Then this one, I like the framing of VUCA conditions. The VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And those words help remind us that the context that we're working in, really this world that we're living in, is incredibly volatile, incredibly uncertain, super complex, and quite ambiguous. And so, I mean, just look at the nature of this call is actually pointing to that a little bit. We have multiple Andrew Beckers just showing up in the call. What's going on there? There are all these dynamics, and zooming out in COVID-19 and climate change and all of these global issues. They're not just one thing. There's not something concrete that you can point to, and really recognizing that there's so much volatility and complexity. There's so much that we don't know, and all of it seems to be in this fog, this haze of smoke of ambiguity. And so with that, we then return to the practitioner. We return to ourselves as instrument, as you will see later in the presentation. And so from there, how can we orient ourselves in a skillful way that promotes the flow of development? Take a more evolutionary perspective and recognize that in any given moment, we can consciously participate in the evolution of this universe. We are unique expressions of that evolutionary process, and all that we do is a part of that. And so that perspective of development is very different from the typical perspective of going and doing development on a community, on a given area. And so really orienting towards that flow and trying to move things along in a way that takes a more facilitator type role rather than a direct change agent going and acting upon a community is also important. And so those are just a few points to keep in mind. And we start with those because a lot of the time we're asked when thinking about integral theory and its practical applications, people are like, so what? How do we, like, yes, integral theory is this very comprehensive meta theory of reality that seems to be quite interesting, many people say. But how is that relevant to my life? How is that relevant to the work that I do? And that's a question that we get a lot. And a lot of people want this kind of step-by-step process of going and designing an integral project. And that's not, it's much easier said than done. And so you'll see that we have actually made attempts in creating a step-by-step process, but we hold those steps very lightly. And it's more these orientations and these other principles that you'll be seeing that guide us in this integral project design process. And it's not so much about simply executing these steps that you'll also be seeing. Before I continue, just to mention a little bit more about the course, the way we've designed it is it really works for anyone at any stage of that project process. While a lot of it is, you can probably take the fullest advantage going from just this budding idea or even no clue of a project, and really move from that, I don't know, let me lean into this emergent dynamic of life to discover what I might be able to contribute. Or you can be moving and shaking for a long time with a project, and you can grab some of these orienting principles and practices, and revisit the way you've designed that project through this integral mapping process as well. And so this integral mapping process that we'll be touching on is something that, like I said, tries to capture that. What is this? What might be a more structured, guided way of making a project a reality that really is based in a more integral approach. And when I say integral approach, I would say, if I were to simplify that down to its essence and what integral theory really does help bring to the table in relation to the work that we're doing, is a framework that helps us work with interiorities. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the four quadrants, and if not, we'll be taking a look shortly. But the four quadrants of integral theory provide us a very simple framework of working with not just the exterior dimensions of reality, our physical health as individuals, our behaviors, our actions, or on the collective level, the systems and structures and policies and laws and all of these ways that we organize ourselves as human beings. That's the realm of most projects these days. And we're seeing the limitations of that perspective of only staying in the exterior quadrants. And so integral theory really helps us not just remember and recognize that interiority is a part of our reality, but actually really diving into the nuance of that interiority and discovering what's actually there and how might we work with it. And so that's what we try to capture as well in this integral mapping process. And these principles is really working with those interiorities and showing their manifestations in the exteriority, and really recognizing that all four quadrants are tetra emerging in the moment, which is something I'll unpack a little bit later. And so in this integral mapping process, we have several steps, and we always start with connecting to your sense of purpose. And this one's challenging. It's not an easy task to identify your life's purpose. And so we don't ever expect anyone to, I mean, even we have some meditations and some guidance in how to do that. But even with that, we don't expect someone to go from not really knowing their life's purpose to all of a sudden discovering it. It is a lifelong journey that we are on to really lean into that sense of purpose. But just for a fun exercise to kind of get a sense of the flow of this process, just take a moment real quick, if you have a pen and a piece of paper there, or if you want to share with us in the chat, but you don't have to, just try to capture briefly right now, what is your sense of your life's purpose? And just write down a sentence there, just to feel what it's like to do this step. Well, this is an ongoing life process. So maybe you started to get those gears working around what your sense of purpose is. And we start there because it really helps us connect to either something deeper and more grounded, or more spacious and bigger and higher and greater than ourselves. And from that place, we can really find the motivation to do this work. It's not an easy thing to try to help make the world a better place, as many organizations and people claim to do. And it's not easy, and it's very challenging. And so if we can have some sort of guiding motivation and energy, it can help bring us, move us along. And then the other step that connects very much to connecting to your sense of purpose is choosing a focus area. And so this one, we invite you to reflect on what's currently happening in your life. We really try to bring this into the present moment and recognize that you're living life now. You're doing things now. And so designing a project doesn't necessarily have to mean, radically changing everything you're doing and starting from scratch and building something new. It can, but really, as much as possible, we try to orient towards what's already emerging and having some faith in the intelligence of emergence, and really sensing into where you might focus your energies in your life currently, orienting towards the creation of a project for social transformation. And so again, if you'd like, you can choose a focus area, or maybe some of you that already have a project, maybe capture the focus area of that project right there on a piece of paper to move along with us in this process. Excellent. So those first two, they're very much oriented towards the self, very much oriented towards you as an individual. And so one of our key kind of guiding orientations or principles here is really working to develop ourselves as instruments. And we frame this by thinking about our capacity to sense in what is needed in the moment and respond skillfully. So it's really leaning into that emergence, leaning into that moment by moment participation in our work, especially when we begin and continue to work with groups of people. This becomes very helpful, because the ways that groups of people come together can really be challenging to work with. And so developing ourselves as instrument, developing a set of skills and capacities to be able to be skillful is incredibly important. And that can be very much facilitated by an ongoing reflection of our own self-development. Those of you that are familiar with integral theory, Ken Wilber talks about the stages of consciousness, and there's many different ways to slice that piece of pie and of developmental psychology and development in general. Personally, we use at IWB, we use Ken Wilber's colors and the way that he's kind of divided it throughout his work, but we're very much aware of and bringing in spiral dynamics, and I'm personally a big fan of Terry O'Fallon's work, and I like the way that she's really gotten into the nuance of the later stages, and not just theoretically, but actually through empirical evidence showing how these stages are showing up in the world is really powerful stuff. And so that has helped me. I've taken her test, and it kind of spit back to me my stage of consciousness, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm here, and leaning into that, reading about it, reflecting on it. And it's actually been catalytic for my own development. Just that orientation towards where am I at on this spiral of development can really help move me along that path as well. And so here we have this orientation of, like I've mentioned, we're not going and doing development on a community, but rather we are participating and dancing with this ever-changing world. And that's why we have this image of the dancer. We really try to dance with the VUCA conditions that we are in. And we also,
Can I add something, Andrew, before you move on from this
yeah.
slide? In many project design courses, I would say, or leadership courses, the emphasis is, again, exteriority being quite emphasized. The emphasis is on building capacities and skills and learning tools. And we do a little bit of that in our course. We have a tool that we teach. But really, the idea of developing self as instrument is sort of complement that with how do we, as we face challenges in our world that are increasingly VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, how do we develop the spaciousness and capacity to really be with that and recognize that there are going to be moments where we just don't know what to do, moments where we have to throw away all of those tools and all of that learning and just be with the moment and respond skillfully. So that capacity to really be with the uncertainty and the mess of it all is really, that's really alive for me right now. And I think for a lot of us right now. So I wanted to make that connection.
Definitely. Yeah, it's an excellent point. Thank you, Danielle. Great. So these kind of first two, so you see how the way I'm going through this is taking this integral mapping process, which are these more, not necessarily concrete, but more concrete than the abstract concept of developing self as instruments, and kind of lining up this process that you can go through for designing a project and complementing it with those deeper principles and orientations. And so that's how we'll be moving through the rest of this presentation. So the one that we'll be focusing on mainly today, that we'll take a little more time to unpack and you'll get to practice, is identifying the driving forces of your project. And so this means recognizing that this project and specifically your focus area or topic issue has so many influencing factors. There's so much contributing to the development or improved well-being or whatever the issue is. For example, the community finance program that I use as an example throughout the course, the main issue is the bigger issue is the general well-being of the community, but then we focus in on the financial management. So what does financial security, stability, and well-being look like in the community? And there are so many contributing factors that influence that. And then from that list of contributing factors, we lean into the driving forces. We discover those ones that really have great potential to move this system that we are identifying and working with. And so we'll get a better sense of what that means in a moment. And so before we get into the activity, a general orientation for exactly what I'm describing here is tending the garden with love. It's using the metaphor of the garden, using the metaphor of facilitating and cultivating the necessary conditions for life to flourish by helping others to develop themselves and their communities. And so with the garden, you are not going and seeing that a plant hasn't grown as tall as you want it to have grown and grabbing it and pulling it up to make it grow faster. That's just silly. That's not how it works. Instead, you are making sure that there's enough water, that there's enough nutrients, that the plants are happy. I myself and Danielle and I, we participated in a permaculture design certificate, and we recognized that, oh wow, there's so much going on in these natural ecosystems of how they're supporting one another. And so the one beautiful concept that I love from permaculture is when you add the human to that dynamic. A lot of times we say, oh no, the human is bad, we need to remove the human from nature and let nature figure itself out, right? But we're humans, we're here, we're impacting the world always. And so how can we do that skillfully? And so one concept is maximizing our handprint rather than minimizing our footprint, rather than shrinking down my impact and hiding in a corner. I'm living life. So how can I actually skillfully, and this comes to self as instrument as well, maximize my handprint, engage with my hand in the garden to facilitate these beautiful conditions where life can flourish there. And we take that same orientation towards all of the work that we do. We are facilitating and participating in creating these necessary conditions for life to flourish. And one way we can do that is asking ourselves what wants to emerge in all four of the quadrants that we'll move into next. Where are things flowing and where are they stuck? Really sensing into that sense of flow and those sticking points. And that's something that is a little abstract and hard to really pin down in a presentation and does take practice. But there's this way that we can recognize where development is already happening, where things are already moving along in a happy, beautiful, beneficial direction. And so maybe we can encourage those and help those move along. Or we can see where things are stuck and we can kind of see where they might be able to go, but there is this sticking point that we might be able to remove to help allow that to flow as well. And so there you see the image of the river underneath. We really orient as a river moving along and flowing. And we do this with humility. It can be very easy to take this perspective of, oh, yes, I am facilitating development here as the grandmaster puppeteer. And so I am working to remove this sticking point here and flow things along there and really take this position of overseer and controller of things. And that can be very dangerous. And we see that a lot in the integral community. We see that once we've noticed that, oh, there is this spiral of development. There is this process of a greater capacity to hold complexity, a greater capacity to make sense of the universe. And then I see, oh, yes, I am on one of those later stages. So I am better than you. It says it right here. And I take this very elitist perspective. And it very rarely is that explicit, but it's so easy to fall into it. I notice myself falling into it all the time in my work, really thinking, yes, I know best. And so how can I, like we see here in the orientation, strive to see and know as much as I can, knowing that I'll never see it all. It's not possible for me to have the whole picture. And we recognize once we get to the integral stage of consciousness that we all have a partial truth. And so how can I remember that my truth is partial as well? And so I need your partial truth to be able to get a bigger picture, to be a more complete, comprehensive picture of what's going on. And the four quadrants help us do that. And so I'll briefly go through these because I'm pretty sure that the majority of you are familiar with them. And I'll use the example of the community finance program to help orient us for our practice, which will be answering the question down below where it says the inquiry for project design. In each of the four quadrants of integral theory, what are the factors that influence my project? And so we have these very simple four quadrants that help us remember and include the interior dimensions of what's going on in any given context. And so here you can place your issue in the center. For example, financial stability of San Juan, Comalapa, Guatemala. That's what I've done with my project. And so you can get as specific or as general as you'd like, but you do want to have a focus area. And then move around the quadrants and think, what is influencing the success or the movement, the development, the evolution of that issue. So for example, in the upper left of intention, here I'm using the quadrants as quadrivia rather than putting myself in the center and thinking of my own personal intention. I'm doing a move where I'm taking a more third person perspective while always remembering that I'm participating as well. Because when we do that move of objectivity, we can forget that, oh yes, but I am a part of all of this. And we can fall into this more puppeteer puzzle piece moving around and solving dynamic. And so here we can place that issue in the center of the community finance program and think about the indigenous Maya woman that we work with and her interiority. And one driving force that I've identified is her felt sense of empowerment? That does she feel like she is the protagonist in her own life story? And so that's a very powerful factor when working with financial health. Then in the upper right, we have her physical health, definitely very important, but we also have her actual capacity and habit of saving money, of receiving an income, planning, moving that money around, her outside behavior that I can actually, if I'm there with her, observe and see and analyze. She's moving through her money management in her life. Then in the lower left, we have the culture of the community, for example, the interior of the collective and the stories and understanding of finance and the financial system, perhaps. One interesting thing that really influenced my understanding of the challenges in very rural Guatemala was recognizing that the Maya cosmovision and the traditional ways that culture has evolved over time for millennia was oral. It wasn't written down. It wasn't ledgers and mathematics in the sense that, you know, we are tracking our income and expenses and the ways that the current financial system works now. That's not how finance and exchange of value has worked for centuries and millennia in that culture. And while, yes, modern day indigenous Mayan people are very much modern and participating in that society, there is this cultural inertia that is present. And this move from oral to written has actually been a very big challenge in a lot of the more indigenous cultures of today. And then in the lower right, we have the systems, right? We have so much there. I mean, the one really easy one for me that always comes up first is the roads in Guatemala are terrible. To get to these rural areas, it's very, very challenging. And so if there's not access to a typical bank or financial system there, that's a big challenge. It's just the physical infrastructure. But then there's also the ways that the banking system is structured, where you charge interest and you have certain guarantees on loans, and all of these written policies and procedures of the banking system live in that lower right quadrant as well. So that was a quick example of how you can identify influencing factors on a given issue. And so take a moment now on a piece of paper, simply draw the 4 quadrants, very easy. And we'll take about 5 to 10 minutes. Let's see how we're doing with time. Yeah, we'll take about 10 minutes, and we'll invite you to just be in more of a brainstorming mode. Don't worry about how perfect or relevant what you're discovering is, but place some sort of issue. And if you can't think of an issue, just look at your own life. That's also helpful. Place yourself in the quadrants and look how you're doing, and maybe Andrew's overall well-being I can place in the center, and then I can identify my psychological and mental health and my physical health, and I can identify certain factors for myself. That can also be a very simple practice here. But really, as much as you can, try to find a project topic and take the next 10 minutes to brainstorm and write through it.
Howard shares, my sense is that culture includes the all-inclusive history of systems, political systems, economic systems, etc.
Yeah, interesting. And so here we get into the nuance between interior and exterior. So the interior is it's not tangible, right? It's not something that we can really actually point to. We can only point to and see its exterior manifestation, right? And so culture is more this shared belief system, for example, right? This shared understanding of the ways that the world works. You can take a look at more traditional amber cultures that are very much going to church every day and believe in God, and they believe in maybe the original sin, or that this life is just a test for me getting to the gates of heaven. There are these like really powerful beliefs that communities have that then actually influence what they do and create. And so the existence of the physical church, and you can actually see communities designed around the church. You can see the church in the center of a community, and then the ways that the roads are structured and the way that that whole community is developed has been around that church. And so that's a physical, more infrastructure systems manifestation of that cultural belief. Right? And the political systems, economic systems, there's the beliefs and understanding of them culturally and individually as well. And that's another dynamic. But then how do they actually show up? And one way of them showing up is the actual physical printed money, the written, you can look up the laws and the structures of the political systems, the laws and the structures and the procedures of the economic systems, and they're written and laid out there. And then that's kind of this way that society, we have come together to organize our movements and the ways that we relate to one another. And so that's the exterior expression of that. Yeah, and then Brian adds the interiors are intersubjective. They're subjectively qualitative rather than objectively quantitative. Yeah, exactly. But to continue with our linear process into non-linearity, so Dimitri had asked, well, what do those non-linear ways of working look like? And while I would love to, and I have on the back burner a course in quantum social change, where really leaning into the quantum dynamics of the universe and recognizing that it's not just playing out at the subatomic level, and it does have very real consequences at this macro level. I won't get into it. It's something that I love to talk about, but there's that. But in terms of this course, and this course is also designed to be introductory in a way of kind of simplifying and distilling the core points of integral theory and project design, but it's also very much set up to be a foundation upon which we can build. And we do have a plan rolling out of building later kind of level 2, 3, etc. of these courses. But one way that we do bring in the non-linearity is simply through systems theory and identifying feedback loops. And so what we have here, and I couldn't find the one, there was an image that I had that labeled exactly what these letters are, but I can just tell you. So first, what you've done here is you've drawn the 4 quadrants and you've identified those factors, right? Then a later step is analyzing their relationships. And so we actually have a sensitivity analysis. That's a table that helps you actually reflect upon how does one factor influence another factor. And so A through G here are the letters that correspond to my factors in my project. And so then based on that sensitivity analysis and just drawing the one-way relationships of, for example, A influences B, and you see that there's a line that goes from A to B. And I wish I could remember exactly what A and B are. A is one of the driving forces, which is the felt sense of being the protagonist in the woman's life story. And B, I believe, it might be self-confidence, or I don't remember. But the point not so much is the actual story that emerges from this, but the drawing of the dynamics and the relationships among them. And so first you just draw all of the lines, and then you focus on your driving forces, which I'll speak to in a moment. And you look for feedback loops. You look for ways that, for example, very simply, A has a line going to G, G has a line going to A. And that means that A and G are simultaneously influencing one another. And then depending on the actual dynamics of the relationship, it's either a positive reinforcing feedback loop, where more of A means more of G, means more of A, means more of G, and we have that. Or it could also be that A increases G, but G decreases A. And so A and G are a stabilizing negative feedback loop. And so you look at this and then you zoom in, and yeah, so just simply then you zoom in, or so you found these relationships, and then you highlight the most important ones. And so then we have a relationship here where we're including at least 3 of the 4 quadrants. And we have actually, and this one is quite powerful. And I remember this one because it's one of the main stories of our program, is the felt sense of protagonism, being empowered, and I am in control of my life. That very much influences the cultural belief around, and this is related to money, the cultural belief around participation in the financial system, where it's not just you go to the bank and the bank gives you services and you have your savings and this kind of passive individual, I'm using the money system, but actually recognizing that, oh, I am the system. I am a part of this system. And that allows for a shift in the exterior of actual creation of new systems. And so here in the community finance program, what we've facilitated is the creation of a network of savings groups where the women have created their own informal credit unions. They're managing their own money, deciding their own rules, and they're actually creating this alternative financial system, which is the factor L there on the right. And so this belief and cultural collective understanding of what it means to participate in the financial system manifests itself in this design of an alternative way of doing things, which then very much reinforces, as each member is participating in that system, that sense of protagonism. And that actually goes both ways and is a self-reinforcing feedback loop towards this positive direction. So that's one way of incorporating more nonlinear dynamics into your project design.
And Dimitri, your question about it in contrast with spiral dynamics, which is more, speaking to, as integral theory speaks to, vertical development. It's a meta theory, right? It's looking at huge, broad arcs of human development across the span of evolution. So Ken Wilber is this like really expansive thinking, and integral theory is really expansive. It's a meta framework. And we find that with projects, when you're really in the weeds, you need these more mid-level frameworks to understand the complex dynamics that are happening in a community at any given moment. So that's where systems thinking comes in. And that's where we've sort of layered the quadrants with the feedback loops from systems theory. Otherwise, trying to move a community from, let's say, amber to orange is just, where do you begin? It's just not, it's not really the goal for an individual or even an organization. We're looking at creating healthier processes in the contexts that we're working in.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the later slides that we may or may not get to is meeting people where they're at, both people and groups of people. And so recognizing that we can only be right where we are on whatever spectrum you like to look at. I'm here now. How you doing? And I don't orient towards you as, yes, you're there, but I want you to be here. I want you to be further down the line. So I'm going to do what I can to move you. Rather, oh, hey, you're here. Let me learn about what here means for you. And this comes to the meaning making that Brian is presencing as well. What's the story of being here in your life? And that very much is expressed through that stage of consciousness, through that meaning making pattern. And so really orienting towards health and as deep as you can get in the understanding of where it means to be Andrew Becker here in this moment. How can I facilitate that for someone else rather than trying to move them along?
Yeah, if I can interject, Andrew, and what
only briefly. I know you love to go off on tangents, and I love your tangents, but just very brief, Brian.
Briefly. So the value and basis of Dimitri's question for me is Claire Graves' deep appreciation for the developmental levels of those respective worldviews. And so this is kind of my grounding, even in relation to the integral model, is because the integral model is non-exclusive in terms it's not inclusive, but it's non-exclusive in terms of participation across multiple levels. And this is, so, but why what you're presenting here, Andrew, is because it begins to tie it all together for me within that kind of more expansive context of small group collaboration. The complexity is such for me, I got to keep it simple and try and get the work done in a relatively, and maybe scale that the work of the group. But the focus on, as you say, the interiorities, as qualitative dimensions. And so attending to the experience, the shared experience as shared qualities, and what that means, how that translates.
Beautiful.
Well said.
Yeah, good. Excellent. I love it. I love it. And this is a conversation I would love to continue to have. And we have this ongoing series of the virtual cafes on every other Sunday, and this upcoming Sunday we'll have one. And so this could be something that we bring into that conversation and unpack even more. I love it. So we're coming up on, we got about 19-20 minutes left. I do want to give you guys at least a look into what are the steps after this. I won't go into any sort of detail on those steps. We might do another workshop in the future that highlights a different one, but also, take the course and you'll learn all about it. And then we'll open it up to a little more dialogue and some questions and answers. So I've mentioned this briefly. We have identified these driving forces, and the term driving force as opposed to factor, the factor comes from this big brainstorm and all of these lists that are emerging. And also I want to highlight that we encourage people to do this. It's actually much more beneficial if you do this with others, with other people, because actually, and I haven't said this yet, but actually what we're doing here in this integral mapping process has nothing to do, I wouldn't say nothing to do, but it is not about objectively discovering what's actually happening in reality. It's not saying that this is what's going on, point in fact, right? It's more, and it's a very subtle difference and easy to forget. It's actually mapping for myself and others my current perception of reality, which very much comes through my meaning making, through my entire life story into this moment, based on where I'm at and what I see and the tools I have. This is what I think is going on. And so when we do this with others, my story might be different from yours. And so we have these conversations and these dialogues around this that then, at the very least, increase the likelihood that what we're capturing here is more comprehensive, right? And so the driving forces that emerge from that brainstorm list, emerge in conversation, and also emerge in a longer process that we don't touch on here. But basically, when you're doing project design, you can think of it as like doing a market study, for example. You have interviews, you have focus group discussions, you have all these conversations, you do literature review, you do all of these things that we don't bring very explicitly into the course because there's so much out there on learning how to do those things. You can find a million YouTube videos on how to conduct a good key informant interview. And so we don't get into that. We more take that and say, okay, what's a more integral perspective on it, right? And so the driving forces come from that process where you're actually discovering, oh, this one factor of the felt sense of empowerment of the woman in the community, that keeps coming up over and over and over again in all of our conversations everywhere. Look at how many times that's become relevant in the stories that we're telling. And so that is an indicator of a driving force for this issue of financial stability, for example. Then with that, you've had these driving forces and now you're analyzing their relationships. I showed you a little bit about drawing those, but that actually comes from a table, a sensitivity analysis that we won't get into. But the basic idea is, how does one driving force influence another? Then you identify your zone of influence. Actually, you get a score that comes out of that table, and it's all, I wouldn't say all arbitrary, but it's very subjective and quite arbitrary. But again, the point is what stories are revealing themselves to you, not so much the actual objective concrete results. And so that zone of influence helps you focus on how to visually represent the system. And so that's why you saw I circled A, I circled L, I circled these factors, because that came out from my zone of influence and then helped me focus where I'm visually representing the system. And that visual representation are just simply drawing the lines. And when I say system, I'm not talking about lower right here. I'm talking about this emergent design that we're creating of the interrelationships among all of these factors that we're discovering. Then from there, we get into more explicit storytelling. We actually discover the story of the present and the future. So from that visual representation, from the feedback loops that emerged, I started to see this story emerging of what I explained to you, right? Of how the empowered woman changes the way that society is perceiving the financial system, creates a new financial system, which influences her empowerment again. And there's a feedback loop there. And so it's this story of what's happening. And that's just one component. The story that we've created with the program is much more comprehensive, takes in a lot of other factors. And so we're discovering what we believe to be the current reality. And then from this, and this actually, a lot of this comes from Theory U, which I didn't bring into this conversation. But then how is the future emerging in the present? Then we have this present story. What does it want to be? What is emerging from this? How does the disempowered woman that doesn't know anything about financial management and just feels like life is happening to her and there's nothing she can do about it, how does a community that feels very similarly go to a community that is creating their own financial system? And that's a shift that happens. And that shift and that vision then becomes our kind of North Star for these later steps, which are designing the impact chain and action plan. That's combined into one. And this is from very simple logic model, theory of change, desired outcome. What are the steps that lead to that outcome? How do you capture it in a series of activities that you can put in a Gantt chart or what have you? And we just briefly touch on that. Because again, there's so much information out there about that way of managing projects, and your typical project design course is going to focus there primarily. But we say, hey, yes, go and take one of those other courses if you want to really gain a lot more skills in that more orange way of working. However, we only use that as one way of orienting towards social transformation. So with that, I'll just give you guys a glimpse of the last two slides, and then we'll open it up to conversation. So this
Well, okay, keep it brief.
I won't even talk about them. Meeting people where they're at. Here's the spiral. People are at different stages. They make different translations or understandings of the world. And how can we translate our story to be relevant to the stories of others? And in that story process, there's actually this overlapping dynamic that happens as we generate these stories based on our meaning making and the ways that we are being impacted and enacting the world in that storytelling process.